also with us today Antonio San Martin. Antonio was working with him some many years ago, and he has been collaborating also with John Hejduk, etc. Some projects that finally were built here in Santiago. What is a kind of miracle, no? When I remember when you won the competition with this beautiful model that somehow was a kind of miracle that some years later this project is already open, and I think it's a fantastic project. You wrote you participate also, you did an interview in El País, you was talking about Andrés Perea, and I like very much that you were saying, well, I am the architect, but Andrés Perea has been working on the construction of this. Andrés is a very good friend of IAAC, and I mean, all together have been working very hard in this fantastic project. I would like also to remember one person that always was talking about you, Ignacio Morales. He was also a very important architect here. He was participating in many of the theoretical adventures, and well, he's a pity and he died some years ago. And so Peter has a long history on architecture. We have also today Federico Correa with us, and maybe Oriol Boigas should be coming. If someone sees Oriol Boigas, he has a seat here, so you should invite to sit here in the middle. So that's all. It has been an informal presentation. Architecture is just thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. It's clear that architecture is alive and well, not only in Madrid, but in Barcelona, even though football is not so good in Madrid as Barcelona. Unfortunately, I cannot wear the shirt of Barca because since I'm working in Galicia, I have to support Deportivo. And so you will understand why I don't wear the Barca shirt today. I think I'm the only architect, and one of my great triumphs in Spain is that I made a full-page picture in AS, which none of you know or read, but I do. My favorite team actually is in the first place in the second league, Rayo Vallecano, which is the team of the people in Vallecas. So none of you probably are aware of that sort of thing, but it's something I keep up with. I want to say two things before I get to my talk. One is I'm really very pleased that Federico Correa is here, who is a friend, a great friend for 43 years. We met 43 years ago. And probably the great change in the world is that when I first talked in the Colegio in Barcelona 43 years ago, Federico said, well, you better speak in Italian. And I said, well, I don't speak Italian. He said, well, you don't speak Spanish, and nobody here speaks English, so speak Italian. And you have to remember that. And I started to speak Italian, and Federico, by the way, is not a neutral character in this story, started to translate into Spanish, and I knew enough Spanish to know that what he was translating was not what I was saying, but what he wanted me to say. So I'm fortunate tonight to have him sitting there, not having to translate. The second point. I believe that since the latter part of the 18th century, or let's say ever since the consciousness of architecture as a discipline in the late 14th and 15th century in northern Italy, there has been a concern for the relationship of architecture to that's the object of architecture, to all of us as subjects, that is, people who use, design, think about, live in architecture. And I believe that architects in the 18th century, after they were no longer serving a single ruler like a pope, a duke, a king, a prince, but were beginning to serve the people after the French Revolution, there was another consciousness that occurred. And that consciousness occurred when there was a definition of the two poles of consciousness articulated in the 18th century between what is called genius loci and genius seculi. Genius loci was the idea that places of building, of places of power, places of gathering, had special meaning, that there was a certain spirit genius of the place, loci being of the place. And at the same time, there was an idea, because of the French Revolution and because the time of the French Revolution was a time of change, that genius seculi, or the spirit of the time, which was translated into the 19th century into the German term zeitgeist, that time also had a special meaning. So that in our 19th and 20th century, architects can be divided between those architects who believed in genius loci, the spirit of place, and that place would animate the work, and between those who would argue that architecture was genius speculi, or the genius of time. The first architect to recognize this, and I'm afraid I don't have the slide since I wrote this lecture last night in response to many of the media that I have met in Spain in the last 3 or 4 days. The first architect conscious of this was an architect named Piranesi, who in 1762, some 36 years or 26 years before the French Revolution, suggested an idea of a place that was no longer merely place-bound, but also time-bound. And this drawing, called the Campo Marzio, the field of battle, which was an actual place in Rome, Piranesi drew this as if it were not place-bound, but a manifestation of different times. And so when you look at this drawing in 1762, you see buildings from first century Rome that didn't exist any longer in his time, but were just part of an imaginary place. They were buildings which did exist in 1762. They were buildings that he imagined that never existed, so that is in no time. So we had first century buildings, we had buildings of 1762, and buildings of no time. And then, in the most remarkable sense, was we had buildings that existed in 1762 that Piranesi moved from their actual site to another site, and that he moved and changed their scale, so that the Colosseum was now a different scale than the scale of the map. The Piazza Navona was a different scale than the actual Piazza Navona, and was moved. So that Piranesi was the first one to think of genius loci as a genius seculi, that is, a genius of time. And this map, the Campo Marzio, stands as a kind of emblem of the idea that place and time are important and, as it were, what I would say in the English language, I wouldn't know how to translate it, imbricated. That is, not dialectical, but existing within one another as a kind of yin-yang phenomenon. The first person in modern times to realize this was the man by the name of Siegfried Gideon, who wrote a book called Space, Time, and Architecture in 1940, which was a Bible for all of us growing up in the mid-19th century. And what we began to realize was that architecture, which had always been place-specific, tied to a genius loci, was in fact needed to be place non-specific. And so we have architects like Le Corbusier and others putting buildings on pilotis so that the place they are is immaterial, and then they could be anywhere, moved any place. And so modernism was about the attempt to move architecture away from being place-specific to place non-specific. Now, if we take the condition of sculpture, the exact opposite thing happens. That sculpture, which was always a marketable commodity, that existed on a pedestal, on a sacred no place, because it could move its pedestal from the Louvre to the Prado to the Metropolitan in New York, wherever it was sold. It was a commercial piece. Sculpture began to say, we don't want to be on a pedestal or a frame as painting was. We want to be site-specific like architecture. And so we had in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the world of sculpture people like Robert Smithson, who would do works like the Spiral Jetty, which were site-specific. They were no longer commodities. And this changed sculpture enormously. And of course, Rosalind Krauss, the art critic, wrote a very important essay called Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And what happened, our whole idea of what the real thing was and what the original was, since the Spiral Jetty was a place in Utah that nobody could really get to, were the pictures of the Spiral Jetty, the drawings of the Spiral Jetty, the commodities, the reproductions, the multiples that could be made from the Spiral Jetty. And the art market then changed from the actual thing itself to a facsimile, a reproduction of reality. And so sculpture and film and photography, which became part of arts, began to show us a different reality than place itself. Even though sculpture was becoming place-bound, genius loci, the commodities produced by sculpture were not. And for example, Robert Morris, the American painter of those days, of the American minimalist, even began painting on frames of his work rather than within the frame itself. So the whole question of what was reality genius loci, or was reality of the time, of the spirit of the time which made photography and film into artworks, became a very important problem. And so what happened then was that after the war, architects began to think again. And no longer did they want their buildings to be on pilotis, nowhere, but they wanted them to be somewhere. Mies van der Rohe, for example, began putting his buildings on sacred places on plinths, whether the building was the Barcelona Pavilion of before the war or the Berlin Museum or buildings at IIT. They were on sacred places marked off in time. We even have the American architect Robert Venturi in the 60s when this change began to occur, writing a book in 1966 called Complexity and Contradiction, which had to do with the first point of my talk, that is, where meanings could be multiple, to in 1972 talking about a book called Learning from Las Vegas, where Las Vegas became the genius loci. And Aldo Rossi, an Italian architect, became important because he tried to relate architecture and various forms of architecture to the context of the city. And he wrote the book Architecture of the City. Ultimately, this attitude of the genius loci was concretized by a man called Christian Norberg Schultz, who wrote a book in 1979 called Genius Loci, Towards a Phenomenology of Architecture, which in a strange way brought Heidegger's notions of phenomenology into architecture. And so there was this back and forth between genius loci and genius seculi. Manfredo Tafuri, in an essay written in 1975 entitled Meditations of Icarus, wrote about my work at that time, which was all about genius seculi, the zeitgeist. And Tafuri spoke of a person metaphorically named Icarus, who was the son of the one of the gods, Daedalus, who made the labyrinth, who was an architect. And he said Icarus wanted to get away from his father and was not interested in the labyrinth or the genius loci, but wanted to find out what made the sun shine. And so Icarus decided to fly to the heavens, to leave the ground, to find out what it was like in heaven. And of course we know what happened to Icarus. Icarus had wings made of wax, and he flew, unbeknownst to him, too close to the sun. His wings melted, and he fell to the earth. Manfredo Tafuri suggested that Peter Eisenman and Icarus were one and the same thing, and having read that terrifying description of who I was in 1975, immediately went into psychoanalysis to find out what it was like to be on the ground. And I would argue that my first project after that time was a project that I did in the Cannaregio area of Venice in 1978. And this was the first in a series then called Cities of Artificial Excavation, which concerned projects in Rome, Berlin, and California, which were all inspired, as it were, by Piranesi's Campo Marzio. That is, looking at Campo Marzio and transforming that idea of time and place into the possibility, the time of place, rather than something that was genius loci or something that was genius seculi, but something that imbricated the two. And to me, what is interesting is that no longer were these two dialectical opposites, but two that possibly would bring the ideas together. Then, In 1982 or 83, I read a book by a French philosopher called Jacques Derrida. And Jacques Derrida argued, as many of the French post-structuralists argued, was that architecture was the political locus of the 80s and eventually the 90s. That this was a place where the idea that there was no longer an immutable relationship between sign and object, a fixed relationship where signs referred to what Derrida called a transcendental object, that there was no such thing as an object before all other signs, that signs were mutable, that they could move, and that objects and signs had an ambivalent and unfixed relationship. And so Derrida argued that architecture, which had been the locus, the genius loci of presence, was the most important subject for philosophers, for sociologists, for anthropologists, for architects to think, because the new ideas of meaning and language could be focused on something that had been supposedly stable for these many years. And the ideas of Derrida became very analogous to me in the book of grammatology that he wrote. We did a project together. Of course, what's interesting about philosophers is that they want the world to stand still while they move around. And so for him, architects were supposed to be about genius loci, so that people in language could speculate about this strange relationship. And of course, I find the same thing about painters. They want museums with white walls so they can hang their paintings, so that the architecture doesn't interfere with the social program of the painting. And I asked Jacques at one time, I said, because he said to me, we were doing a project together of a park, and he said to me, there are no benches in this park. How can people sit down? And I looked at him and I said, Jacques, there are no benches for people to sit down in your texts. It's very difficult to ever sit down in your text. Why do you worry about sitting down in my park? He had no answer to that. And so I began thinking about this work, and that was a third phase of my thinking about architecture, which leads me here tonight to share this with you. And the fourth comes from another philosopher, Theodor Adorno, who wrote a book called, auf Deutsch, Spätstil, or late style. And what Adorno said was that there were periods of time, in real time, that were late, and that it was impossible to do anything about it, that there were no new paradigms. And if there were no new paradigms, that art and culture had to assume the problematic of this lateness, but that lateness could be as creative as earliness or avant-garde. And so he said that lateness was twofold. One, in terms of the times we're in, and I believe all of us in this room are in a moment of lateness. Even though a computer or Facebook may seem like a new paradigm to you, it is not. It is merely another tool. But also he said that there is lateness in terms of one's career. And of course, I always refer to the Coen brothers' No Country for Old Men. I'm always heartened that I find lots of countries for old men, especially in Spain today. And Federico and I, if we are allowed to be old, find ourselves in good humor here. Adorno wasn't referring to Correa or Boigas or me, but he was referring to Beethoven. And he argued that the importance of Beethoven's late work, especially his Missa Solemnis, was an example of a work unlike Beethoven's, but that was promoted, one, by the fact of Beethoven's late age, but the late age in which the work had been done. And he said that the work was difficult, strange, internal, complex, unlike any of Beethoven's previous work. For me, why I believe media finds what I do so consternating for them is because it is a late work, and media thrives on the new. They have to sell newspapers every day. They can't have old news. They have to invent news, even if there is no news. And of course, we must realize they have to make a living as well. And so we have to find a way to create news for them. And we make new shapes, new buildings, etc., so that they can write about them. But I want to refer to the specific project of Santiago, which for me is a late work, both in time and in place. And what is different about Santiago, and which makes it difficult, strange, and internal, that is to architects, because the people of Galicia, the first month it's been open, there were 50,000 people that came in a town of 60,000, and 80% of them loved the project, even though they didn't understand why, just like a lot of people love Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. You don't have to love a meal if you don't know how to cook it. You don't have to be a chef to enjoy a good meal. You don't have to own a bodega to appreciate a good wine. So that the people that come to Santiago don't have to know why they like it. They just have to experience something. Now, for all of us who deal with architecture, there is a reason why perhaps they find it strange and different and complex and internal. And that's because we dealt with a different time. We didn't deal with the time of Santiago when it was unlike Catalonia or País Vasco, but a time of Catalonia that could be, that is in the future. And so our project layers, like Piranesi, 4 different times. It layers medieval time, the time of the cathedral and the time of the founding of Santiago. It layers natural time, the time of the actual hillside that we build on. It layers Cartesian time, which is the time other than medieval time, the time of reason. And it layers digital time, that is the ley lines extrapolated into a digital algorithm, the ley lines that led the Druids to Santiago in the first place, why it is called Compostela, a field of stars, because these people came guided by the stars. I want to say, in conclusion, before I show the pictures, which I think are important, they will speak for themselves, that the above is neither a justification for what I do, nor an apologia, but it's a fact. It is a fact that we are in a late age. I don't believe we are at the end of ideology, as many people think, I believe architecture is still ideological and very much political, because there's a lot of debate about architecture today, and things like sustainability, etc. And I often wonder, isn't Borromini sustainable? But did they argue about it when he did San Carlino or Sapienza? I don't think so. I think these are the political discussions that happen. I think what I was trying to do for all of you as architects is, one, tell you about, I think, the way the world is. That I think architecture is a wonderful thing to study. I think architecture is probably one of the most important disciplines. I think it's probably more important than studying Greek. I haven't known anybody, sorry to say, I have some Greek friends in the audience, but I'm not convinced that Greek is a language we need to learn today. All of the people I know are fleeing Greece. So I think that architecture is a very good way, metaphorically, of explaining the crisis that we have. I have my own ideas about crises because my wife, Cynthia Davidson, said something that Daniel Burnham said, build no small projects, make no small plans, they don't move people. Yeah, they have no power to, they have no power to stir men's blood. I think many of our politicians have no desire to stir anybody's blood. But architecture does have that capacity. So what I was doing tonight is giving you a little insight into what may seem to you a difficult thing to interpret. But the same way went when I was studying Chaucer and Milton and Shakespeare and Joyce and Pynchon. I needed some guide to understand what was happening. And I hope that this brief presentation, before I show you the images, will in some way clarify what it was that an architect, someone just like you, who teaches people just like you, who understands that there are economic downturns. I was born in the Depression. I lived through the economic downturn of 72, of 82, when I started my practice at the moment of the economic downturn. And economic downturns can't last forever. They don't, right? But if you don't have an education, and if you don't continue to believe in the future as the present, then you will always be in an economic downturn. So my feeling is I'm really happy that so many of you are here. Many of you are here because you don't have anything else to do. I realize that. And so I hope at least that you will enjoy seeing the pictures, even if what I have to say may be far from your reality. I ain't sure about that. I think I'm very close to your reality. I still feel very young. I teach every week of my life and have for the past 50 years. I'll never stop teaching because that's why I think I'm able to do what I do and to give the lecture tonight. So with that as a background, we're going to look at some pictures other than Peter Eisenman. Now, I'm not good. I'm a 1.0 person, not a 2.0, which all of you are. I don't know how to tweet. Okay. All right. Do we have? There's no. We don't have a pointer, right?
No.
We have the controller. Oh, okay.
Moving this.
Yellow button. The yellow button? Oh, good. Okay, I'm going to show, and this, I pushed this guy here, this one, right? That one. I'm going to try and do two things at once, push buttons and look at slides. So let's see.
To the macro, because otherwise...
Okay, they can't hear me. Okay. Whoa. I'm not even sure I'm 1.0. This is a picture recently taken of, you can see the Plaza Obradoro, the cathedral of downtown Santiago, and up on the hill you can see the City of Culture. You will see marked in the City of Culture is the medieval grid of the pilgrimage routes, and of course the City of Culture lies right next to the now new route, which is the main speedway between La Coruña, Orense, and eventually to Madrid. So the whole idea is that it's connected through the means of circulation. Whoop. Okay. This was the first model we made. We entered a competition. We didn't decide how big the competition was to be. We didn't decide who was going to be in it. We didn't decide what was going to be in it. But clearly 10 architects of international reputation decided that it was worth doing in 1999. We knew that the idea of Galicia was to do something like the Guggenheim in Bilbao that would attract a different kind of secular tourism. And we knew we didn't want to have a building that looked like Frank Gehry's Guggenheim, even though we knew some of our competitors might make Guggenheim-like buildings. What we wanted to make was a project that was the hillside of Monte Gaias, and that made the pilgrimage routes through it, so that the pilgrimage coming from the east would come through our project like you would stop for a Coca-Cola of some secular refreshment on your way to the Obradoro and the cathedral and to Santiago. So it was a filter rather than a focus, and it was always designed as a filter and a project that would not look like architecture, but would look like something that had come out of the ground. And this is where we're talking about not in the ground, of the ground, but out of the ground. And here on the right, you see a drawing that was the second drawing we made, which was the Cartesian grid, the topographical grid, and the grid of the digital program that as it were, recreated in the algorithm the ley lines which articulate this fourth digital time in the project. And you will see many instances of the Cartesian grid, the digital grid, the topographical grid, and the medieval grid layered into a project which seems to be genius loci, but is not. It is neither dialectically genius seculi, but as I said, the imbrication of both. Here you can see a picture of the four buildings: the Archive Building of Galicia, the Library of Galicia, and the Museum of Galicia, and a building, an administration building, and the start of the construction of a music hall. Critics asked me recently, why should the library be a magnificent building? And I said, because the tradition of libraries that I know are magnificent buildings. And the American architect H.H. Richardson made some of the most fantastic libraries that exist in the United States. He made his career on libraries and railroad stations and other such public functions. So I believe that a library should be a magnificent place, like the New York Public Library, like the British Museum Library, like the Trinity Library in Cambridge where I studied. So it is a place of uplifting of the spirit as well as the mind. I hit too hard. It's going along the wrong way. I'm lost. Keep going back. There you go. Okay, here we have the site plan, which gives you all of the grids. You can see the medieval grid in this deep red. You can see the Cartesian. What happened to John was he realized that his Catholicism could not overcome the cancer that had taken his body. And so this was a west facade of a church without a body, still the spirit being there. And of course we've sited them in such a way so that if you're standing over here, about here, looking through these two towers frame the west facade towers of the cathedral downtown. And I believe for me, knowing John and knowing how important he was and will become to architecture, it's a wonderful thing to have in Santiago. Here is again the south facade of the archive building, and you will notice whenever you see glass, it's very much articulated like the glass is in the upper stories of buildings in places like La Coruña and Santiago, where they're projected like balconies to get as much light as possible because there's many days without sunlight. And so this was a kind of sense of the way glass is used, a transformation of that into the building in Santiago. Here is the building at dusk, the mute, blank stone walls, having a quality of place, but also clearly of another time. And here you can see the ley lines running through the Cartesian grid and the projecting glass. The inside. Now, this was a very important issue. This is the first space that you come to, which is called the Road to Santiago. And we purposely made a glass floor in this space because we wanted to realize that the physical form was not a floor and a roof, but that the floor was the space between another space down here that is below the ground, a virtual ground, and a virtual ceiling, because this is not the ceiling that you see on the roof. So there was this intermediate interstitial space between the roof and the real ground, which it was the virtual ground, designed and made through the ley lines, that is the digital space of the computer. So if you want, the interior space is a virtual space of today and tomorrow, and the external space is the space of today and yesterday, inserted within one another. And therefore it was very important to have this continuation of the lines as a space, a virtual space of the interior of the project. This is in the archive building. And again, the space in these buildings is space, like in Piranesi's Carcery, which was very important also to me, the whole idea of the section being not a section closed off. And if you look at the Carcery, the human figure is also always within the space, but the space keeps jumping up and down. It's never stable or static in one place. And so when you're in this space here, you're already looking down on a space there or up to another space, that the sections are never complete and isolating, but a kind of cascading sense of space. You can see that here in this image of the archive building. So you get here the ley lines, the Cartesian grid, the topological grid, and the medieval grids, all apparent as you are in the space. Here it is on the opening day with people coming to visit the spaces, and the scale. These are the width of these passages are exactly the width of the streets, and the scale, the height of the buildings as they would be down in medieval Santiago. So you have this feeling of something that is out of this time and out of this particular place. And here it is at dusk, again, the arcades that you have in downtown Santiago. So they're a mixture of feelings and episodes in the project. And this is, on the left is the archive building, and in the right the library building that we're going to see next. Again, between the two buildings. And this is outside, and this is one of my and people's favorite places. It's against the law, but we wanted a place where the ground was no longer level, but became like a hill coming up to the building, so that and so this was an idea we had, that this piece of ground lifted up as some of the ground goes down to meet this blank wall of the facade. And of course, this is the favorite place for rollerbladers and others. And of course, everybody's worried that we don't have insurance if somebody, jumps. And of course, it is that kind of possibility always when you are an architect. So somehow everybody seems to like this place, because I don't like heights, and I can't walk up there because it's too problematic for me. It's too steep. It's like skiing without snow. But it's clear that it has become something that we didn't think it would be. That is a focus for little kids running up and down and sliding and doing all kinds of things that we didn't think would happen. Just provide people with something interesting and they will come. And this is the plaza. Again, these squares are the squares of the courtyards of the monastery that is next to this one here and this one here, the same scale as the monastery gardens that are in the Hostal de Reyes Católicos that exist next to the cathedral, and of course John Hejduk's cathedral without a body. So there are all of these potential readings that are there. This is the entry into the library building, and you can even see in the change in the color of the stone the ley lines that come through in the different stonework. The building has been built superbly, and my colleague, as was mentioned earlier, Andreas Perea, has been in charge of the work selflessly, following the work, and has a great feeling for what has happened. And of course, Andreas Perea is able to tell the journalists how much this costs per square meter, unlike some buildings that have been built in Barcelona and Madrid. This is only 2,200 euros per square meter, unlike some that are 4,000 and 6,000 euros per square meter. So it's not necessarily an expensive building. Here is the, as you enter the library space, and on the right down is the rare book library, and another library to the left. Here, looking down on the part of the rare book library, and again you'll see the section coming up over here down to this entry level down, and it's always a continuous section. And here you can see that section, the rare book library being down here, the stacks of the books, part of participating in the lines of the project. They're down here, and this other level up here. So you have an upper level, a lower level, and a second lower level where the rare book stacks are. And there are spaces which are tight, where interior facades run against staircases, and so that you get the sense of scale of people in the space. There can be 2 people or 500 people. That I think the scale works for both. And here is another narrow space where you're up in the upper level of the study carrels, looking down onto the library space we were here, and down onto the staircase to the rare book library. So the 3 levels, again, cascading in. The unique construction of the facades, which we'll see on, I believe, the museum building. Here at the opening, a violin, bass, and quartet playing, and people looking from the different levels. And again, the idea of the roofs being the internal digital space as opposed to the real space of the topographical or the Cartesian. This is all dominated by the digital ley lines that were manufactured through an algorithm. Here with books, and looking through the depth of the facade. It's not a curtain wall facade, but very complex layering of glass onto the museum building, which is going to open. 2 more buildings will open in December, 2 of the 6th. This is one of my favorite shots, looking up at the central services, the administration building, and the museum building, with the external ley lines and the grid, and this again striated setback structure of this facade that we'll see again. And from the other side, and the beginnings of the music hall, the parking lot of the music hall, with the Museum of Galicia and the administration building. And here is the shot during the construction of the facade, the north facade of the museum building. Again, somehow same but different than the facade of the library. And this is one of my favorite parts of it, this stepping out of the Galician windows, stepping out at the same time that there's a double curved surface, so it both steps out and curves, a double curved surface in and giving the facade an enormous plasticity. The thing that you have to realize, because of the digital, we can make every piece of glass different, and yet it's the same price as if it were made the same, because the computer doesn't know that it's being made differently. It just repeats the amount of information that it gets, and all you do is you place them like you would place a square panel of glass into a facade. And so the facade costs little more for the shadowing and the volumetric quality that you get onto it. And again, between the museum building and the services building, and from down below looking up, and you begin to see that the buildings begin to reform the hillside that was Monte Gaius, and again from afar in the mists of Galicia, the Hejduk towers on the right of the project. Can we have the lights or whatever? Maybe we don't have lights. Yeah. We have time. I know some of you have been standing, but I would take comments, questions from any of them, as long as they want to stay and talk. Maybe 10 minutes of questions that they would like to address. Oh, no, you can. You can ask. Now, you always ask hard questions. Go ahead. You have to louder. Good. Yeah. You should take all of these students, as a former teacher, on several buses, and you should go, and I'll be there if they all want to come. Because it's terrible to listen to architecture through the media. You have to go there and be it. And I'm so happy that you're amazed, because I'm amazed how illiterate and unseeing all of our media has become. Yes. 4. Well, the first is the medieval street pattern, which defines the shape of the buildings. Okay, so the buildings are cut the ground, as it were, building is cut by the medieval streets. The height of the buildings which is the topographical grid, is determined by pushing through the medieval grid, not the way the town of Santiago is, but the way the hill was. So we restored the profile of the hill. That's the topographical grid. And the other grid is the Cartesian grid, which is clear to be seen. And the digital grid, which occupies what I call the virtual space, which is reminiscent of the ley lines, these mystical ley lines. Don't forget, these druids thought they saw in the heavens that led them to the place of Santiago. That's our speculative, let's say, sacred lines, which have nothing to do with the three other grids. So there are the four: the medieval grid, the Cartesian grid of the reason, the grid of the natural land, and the grid of virtual speculation. There could be too many. We let them go. In other words, we felt that to control them would be to give the feeling of a space that we all knew. There is a certain, I would agree, cacophony, if you want, that is an overlaying that is very dense. I don't know if you're in the space. I think the pictures look like that, Federico. I'm not certain whether the space feels that way or not. That you would have to, when you go there. Yeah.
Which is all white.
Right.
At least it lets me understand the volume much more. And first begin complication of different materials with the complication of different processes. I'm very nasty to making criticism at this stage.
Well, you have to see, I think the thing is, you have to see the four buildings finished, which they will be in September, and then make, I would expect a letter from you telling me that you agree or disagree. How about that? Can we leave that suspended?
I must say, to finish, I'm absolutely impressed, and I like it very much.
Thank you.
I just think that the question of place and time was so important in the generation of the building.
Yeah.
In all the different, and you've explained it so well. But I want to hear from you how you see the building actually developing over time.
Well, I'm not a mind reader or a palmist. I don't read cards. I would like to think that the building will develop over time through use. It will change. All buildings change. Even in the lifetime of this project, the archive building was another function. The administration building was another function. I mean, we've designed 4 times the music hall. Once it was a opera with a minor stage, then it was full stage, then it was no opera, then there was a black box. I mean, I have to tell you that when buildings are occupied, and all of my buildings and all of any buildings worth their salt change they mutate over time. And I believe this will happen with these buildings. When I first designed the Wexner Center in Columbus, Ohio, was designed for no wall art because the curator said we want to only do large sculpture, virtual art, performance art. the second curator said we want wall art, so we had to change all the glass so that you could show works on paper. So depending who we don't even have a curator for the museum. Librarians, I mean, if you think media people are bad, talk to librarians. They have no sense of what a library could be. They just want to know how do they catalog books, store books, you know, secure books, preserve books, etc. And the great functions of libraries are the spaces of the library. So you're dealing with a complex set of characters outside of the junta, the parliament, the national economic forces that impinge upon these things. So these things go up and down. This project will be a mirror of the first quarter of the century of Galician history in the 21st century. No question will be a record of the ebb and flow of Galicia in relationship to País Vasco and Catalonia, let's say, because it has its own integral language. It has a bloque, pure political party, which is very much Galician, against art from the outside, against anything international. So we will see how these ebb and flows work. But I think architecture is supposed to do that, to grow and change outside of the architect. And I think it's not now in the hands of the architect, it's in the hands of these other fates that will determine what happens. Okay, thank you. Listen, thank you all. I hope that life and architecture come together for many of you, but don't ever get discouraged, because there are many times when Peter Eisenman was without a job and thought that the world was coming to an end. It never comes to an end quite like that. So thank you very much.
One of the directors of the master.
Thank you for having me. By the way, you know, you invited me. This is the third time, so I finally got here, and it's really nice to come because the spirit is really good.
We are a small, independent and so that's very informal.
Very
and
nice.
we try to create space for freedom, for development, for fabrication, for invention. We work from microcomputers to the design of the city. So
Well, I hope